If I look back on the early days, I see someone who was so sure of himself that he was literally unteachable. That obstinacy delayed my recovery by several years and nearly killed me. Unable to stop drinking and unable to keep drinking, I committed suicide. Opiates and alcohol are a deadly mix. There's no reason I should have been found, resuscitated, or still be here, but I woke up the next morning in an ICU anyway, angry, very angry. What I was angry about would take some time to figure out, but for that moment, I knew I was angry at still being alive, still having to navigate another day, another hour, another moment of suffering and existence that had steadily gotten smaller and more painful for over 20 years. My foolproof suicide had become a joke, and the joke was on me. So, now what? One thing addiction does to us is disconnect us from other people and eventually from the world around us. In the days that followed my ICU stint, several people reached out to me to express their happiness that I was still around. These weren't family members or close friends. These were people I barely knew from attending meetings over the previous couple of years. At best, they were acquaintances who made an effort to have a few words with me about what had happened. That opened a door for me, a door I didn't even know existed, much less that it had been closed and padlocked for many years. It would take some time for me to go through that door, but it had been opened just a little. I'd love to tell you that I was born a Big Book fan and understood the program of AA since the day it was presented to me, but in fact I ignored it and misunderstood it for a long time. I also got caught up in the folklore about it, where folklore is defined as what people claim the program says versus what it actually says. I'd also love to tell you that my own recovery began in the pages of the Big Book, but it didn't. I got to the Big Book via a conversation I had with another AA acquaintance after I got sober, and he was a Buddhist. Anyone could put the drink or drug down for a period of time. Detox will help, but even without that, a major effort to distract oneself from the ache that resides inside us will suffice for a time to keep you from picking up. That worked for me my first time around for 3 years, until it didn't. This time it worked for another 3 years, until it didn't. It was around the 4 year mark this time that I had that conversation I mentioned. Year 4 had been undiscovered country for me. Having had 3 years my first time, getting to 3 this time meant I just had to repeat what I'd done before and I'd be all set. Except that at year 4, I ran into the same thing that I'd run into the first time around and picked up over. That ache inside had become louder, noisier, a little more insistent. It hadn't turned into a thought of a drink yet, but that was inevitable. After a meeting one night, I ran into someone I knew and we ended up talking for a few minutes. If I told him about that conversation today, he'd have no recollection of it, but it changed my entire life. We were talking about something that I had struggled with for a long time and had kind of resigned myself to. The way I presented it to him, there seemed to be only one way through it, and that's when he asked me, "Are you sure?" And up to that very moment, the old me would have replied, "Yeah, something, something." But instead, I paused, and out of my mouth came, "I don't know." The value of step 3 is admitting we don't know. When the step directs us to quit playing God, it's asking us to stop insisting that we know, because we don't know, whether we want to admit it or not. And that brings us back to Buddhism. When my friend asked me whether I was sure, he was asking me a Buddhist question. Buddhism teaches that life is suffering, but that suffering is self-created. He was asking me if saying I knew was the source of my suffering, not the thing I claimed to be struggling with. That's what step 3 asked me to do as well. Playing God is saying I know, when really I don't, and each time I lean into insisting I know, my suffering only increases. AA literature tells us that willingness is the key that opens the door of recovery. And in my case, willingness came right after I admitted I didn't know. Up until that moment, I would have said I did know, even if I didn't. So finally, armed with my own answer to a question I'd never even considered before, I walked through the door. With just over 4 years sober, I began to recover. You can too.